Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Professionalism series. So this is the third of 5 sessions on professionalism, hosted by the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue. And our aim is to clarify for everyone, really, but especially non-professionals, what does it mean to be a professional with a capital P, as opposed to the common use of the term, which is understood to mean that somebody's just doing a very good job. In addition, because this is being hosted by an Orthodox synagogue, our speakers were asked to talk about what it means to be a Jewish professional, with the added layer of halacha and Jewish ethics. Most of the speakers in this series are members of the Spanish and Portuguese or Gehr congregations. Today, or this evening, we have a really unique trio of speakers, because each of them is either a president or a past president of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. And I'm just wondering whether there's ever been an occasion previous to this where all three were speaking about themselves. I can understand they were all speaking as part of in a board or in an executive meeting, but to be on the stage and speaking professionally, I think is unique. So our first speaker is Professor James Archibald, who's a past president of the synagogue, and he has degrees from McGill, of course, the most important of them, as well as from the University of Montreal and Université de Lille. He has teaching and research expertise in the areas of management and business, communication and translation studies. He's a professor in the Department of Language and Intercultural Communication at McGill and a member of the Office des Professions du Québec. And I'm going to leave it to Professor Archibald to introduce his topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Ronnie. This is basically a follow-up on the first 2 presentations in our series, where we talked about different issues in ethics. The first one allowed us to give you a backdrop, looking at the commonalities that we find in codes of ethics in different professional bodies. The second one allowed us to look at some very specific ethical issues and some dilemmas which people have to solve in this area. So today, given that we were talking about public administration and accounting, which is very much in the public area, we wanted to focus on some of the issues, some of the ethical constraints in this particular area. As I do usually in my teaching in the real world, I like to make a link between what is actually happening in the real world and the theoretical issues that we're concerned with. So that's why I want to start out with a brief comment about what's at issue today. Then I'd look at the main categories of interest in codes governing professional behavior, which is basically a summary of what we discussed before. Then moving on to the public sector, to look at the overlay of behavioral expectations in the public sector for those professionals who are working in that area. So that could be, for instance, an accountant working for a government agency or working for Revenue Canada, for instance, or it could be a medical professional, a nurse, for instance, working in a hospital from an administrative point of view. As we mentioned before, there are certain lines of demarcation because of the fact that there are issues to be resolved, that there are dilemmas that we live. And so I want to look at where these lines of demarcation are with respect specifically to freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, the expected loyalty in the public sector, and discretion, which is part of professional behavior. Finally, we'll recognize the fact that dissensus, as we've mentioned before, continues to exist in this area, that we're not always in agreement, and that professionals are not always entirely comfortable with the types of decisions that they have to make. So that's our intention. So what's at issue today? I'm not going to go into detail about these things. I simply want to remind you that professional ethics in the public sector is real. It's something which we see on an everyday basis. And so many of you may have followed the inquiry into Joyce Echaquan's death and the conclusions to which Jihan Kamel arrived in the hearing with regard to the ethical behavior of nurses and hospital administrators. More recently, we had the discussion in the media about the residential schools and the children who were discovered in a burial site near a residential school. And it was interesting that when Justin Trudeau made a comment on this, he made his comment as a Catholic. So clearly there was an overlay of his role in public administration and his fundamental beliefs as a traditional Catholic. Then there is the issue of Pierre Fitzgibbon, who didn't comply with the National Assembly's Code of Ethics. That's pretty straightforward. And interestingly enough, the person who basically almost tried to whitewash him was our premier, who is an accountant by training. So that raises also a number of interesting ethical issues. Then, following up on some of the discussions that we had previously in the other two sessions, the National Assembly has a commission which has just ceased its work for the summer break. And it is calling on the College of Physicians to discuss the issue of advance directives for people who have applied for medical assistance in dying. There's a very interesting situation because the Quebec and federal laws are different, where a lady in the Eastern Townships had requested medical assistance in dying, and it was refused initially because of the fact that she could not make a decision at the time of just before her death because of the fact that she may not have been men's competence. So if you have a chance to read this article, it's extremely interesting because it really shows how this plays itself out. And moreover, ever since the decision by the Quebec Superior Court, in which our Solicitor General, Lametti, was asked to harmonize Quebec and federal legislation in cooperation with the Quebec government. He has not done this. And so therefore this puts many Canadians in a situation of vulnerability. So as you can see from all of those things that are in the news today, all of these ethical issues are real. To recap the commonalities, if we look at the different codes of ethics in different professional bodies, we pulled out the major commonalities. Act with dignity, act with integrity, the ability to communicate in a clear and understandable manner, which is very important for the protection of the public, the need to exchange knowledge and experience to make sure that people are better protected, the necessity of maintaining competence on an ongoing basis to maintain quality standards, to avoid discrimination and harassment in the workplace and in client or patient relations. If you think about the Joyce situation, the respect for others and oneself. A professional has to respect himself or herself almost before you can respect someone else. And then there are, of course, the nest of difficult issues dealing with language and the legal constraints, especially in Quebec. So when we look at the overlay of public administration and the ethical constraints of professionals who are recognized by the government as professionals, we see that in addition to the ethical constraints that are imposed on people as members of a professional body, when they join the public sector, no matter what level of government they happen to be working in, there's another layer of expectation. So it's clear in the professional code that dignity is an important issue. However, when we look at the actual behavior, expected behavior in the public sector, public servants are expected to avoid making statements contrary to the dignity of the profession. In other words, if you are an accountant, you should act and behave as an accountant. You should treat all people with dignity. The case of Joyce is a perfect example. The respect for human dignity and the value of every person, and to value diversity. In other words, to create a working environment where diversity actually exists and can actually function. Integrity, again, is an overriding issue in all professional codes. But if you work in the professional sector, in the public sector, it's expected that you will act at all times with integrity and in a manner which will bear the closest public scrutiny. Think of Fitzgibbon. And this obligation is of course, set within legal context. You should also be able to prevent and resolve any potential conflicts of interest. And what's interesting here is that the conflict of interest could be either apparent or potential. Think of the Fitzgibbon story that I just mentioned. And finally, it is important to maintain the employer's trust, because if you work in the public sector and you do it in such a way as to respect all of your obligations from an ethical point of view, that is one of the ways of maintaining the employer's trust. And of course, if there's a lack of trust, that is sufficient reason to end the working relationship. In terms of communication, this is extremely important because professionals have, across the board, a responsibility to communicate with institutions, with their clients, with the public, in such a way as to be understood. In other words, this corresponds to a right, the right to understand. And this is an extremely important right, both in the Canadian context and in the European context. It's becoming more and more important within the context of the European Union. And so in this particular area, if you were a professional working for a government, that you should have a working professional knowledge of Quebec's official language. Not only a knowledge of the language, but a working knowledge. In other words, the spirit of the law is that if you're a nurse practitioner, you should be able to exchange with other nurse practitioners in the official language and to participate in activities. You should provide fair, timely, and efficient, effective services with respect to Canada's official languages. So that's the overlay for the professional working in Quebec and in Canada at the same time. To use clear language in client relations. This is particularly important in areas that are traditionally interested in this particular problem. I mentioned notaries and lawyers, for instance, where it's extremely important for clients to actually understand the content of some of the exchanges. And finally, to encourage respectful communication, respect for others. In terms of knowledge, professionals have particular specialized knowledge in certain areas, and they should be in a position to share that knowledge in such a way that it is in the public interest. So in the public sector, this means that sharing the knowledge is a way to maintain the quality of public life. It's a way to participate in the transmission of knowledge in areas of specialty. And it's a way to educate the public when professionals have the proven expertise. That also relates to the professional codes of ethics, where you are not supposed to speak out publicly on an issue if you don't have the competence to do it. And so you can share this knowledge, and it's an expectation, behavioral expectation, that you will share knowledge responsibly in the public interest. In terms of competence, again, you see this overlay with the public sector, where professionals who at any rate have to maintain their competence have to maintain their competence in a specific area of practice in the public sector. They have to acquire, preserve, and share knowledge in their area of activity, and they have to engage in continuing professional development. The interesting aspect here is that continuing professional development in Quebec is now becoming compulsory, so that all of the professional orders are now in the process of adopting regulations for compulsory professional development. And that's important to maintain quality services in the long term, which brings us to the issue of standards and quality assurance. And so the obligation of the public sector is to maintain excellence in the design and delivery of public sector programs and services, to improve the quality of programs and services on a continuous basis. It's not a one-shot deal. It's part of your ongoing behavior in this area. The final group that I wanted to mention is the issue of discrimination and harassment. This is something which has recently been added to different codes of ethics in the different professional bodies, and in particular with the Barreau du Québec, with the Quebec Bar. And so with regard to this, in the public sector, the expectation is that the certified professional in the public sector will contribute to a nonpartisan public sector. In other words, everybody is treated equally. The professional will contribute to a safe and healthy work environment that promotes engagement, openness, and transparency. Think of Fitzgibbon. Create and maintain safe and healthy workplaces that are free from harassment and discrimination. Think of the issue of Joyce. And finally, to foster a work environment that promotes teamwork where men and women can work together in harmony. And so it's very important that professionals, and one of the topics that we mentioned in our previous session was the sex distribution in the different professions. And so it's important as we move forward, as more and more women move into some of the previously male-dominated professions, that people in the public sector actually pay attention to this particular aspect of the expected behavior. What happens in reality is that there are certain lines of demarcation which appear, and they relate to, at seriatim, the freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, and loyalty is a fundamental value and requirement of the public service. Freedom of conscience is one of those freedoms which is not talked about very much. We talk a lot about freedom of opinion, and we talk a lot about freedom of religion, etc. But in a secular context, freedom of conscience is equally important. So that in the medical assistance in dying issue, for instance, it's not necessarily a point of discussion for people who are practicing Catholics, Muslims, or Jews, whatever it is, but very often it's a question of conscience. The issue of freedom of expression is important as well, because going back to the sharing of knowledge, if a professional actually knows something and knows something is going wrong, to what degree are you free to express these issues? So there are many cases of what we call whistleblowers who have to deal with this particular issue. And then finally, there's the expectation from the public service, and this is clearly laid out by the Treasury Board, that there is a duty of loyalty. In other words, you have to be loyal to your employer. So if you work for the Revenue Agency in Canada, you have to be loyal to the Revenue Agency of Canada, even if you find yourself in hot water because of an ethical issue that you're particularly concerned with. And of course, in all cases, you have to maintain your discretion as a practicing professional. So it's clear, going back to the work of Ruth Amosi, that consensus sometimes is difficult to reach, and that dissensus is always going to exist in this area. And that's why the professionals have to deal with these different dilemmas as they move forward. So in conclusion, I'd like to quote from a text on the administration of human rights in the justice system from the United Nations, from the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And in this particular text, I chose it because of the fact that it deals with freedom of conscience, deals with freedom of religion, freedom of opinion, and freedom of expression, which sums up all of these dilemmas, if you will, that professionals can find themselves in the public sector. And if you may, I'm just going to read this to you because I think it's important to think about it. Respecting these freedoms is a way to ensure the full and effective protection of these freedoms for all without discrimination, and allows for divergences of views, opinions, and ideas that may enrich not only our personal lives, but also the life of society. This is the minimalist and maximalist issue that we discussed before. This helps to nurture increased understanding between and respect for persons with different opinions, beliefs, and religious convictions. People may not always share each other's views, religious beliefs, or opinions on various matters, and may even find them repulsive and unacceptable. But by allowing a free flow of information and exchange of views, ideas, and information, a society allows people of all shades of opinions to take an active part in issues of general interest. The effective implementation of these freedoms is thus also a precondition for a society in which people can live in tolerance, peace, and security. I leave you this evening with that thought in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Archibald. And we'll move right along to our next speaker, who is Mr. Edmond Elbaz, immediate past president of the congregation. I should have mentioned earlier that Professor Archibald was the president before Edmond Elbaz. So we have the successor now, so to speak, and he's going to be speaking. So Edmond Elbaz has a BSc and an MEd, a Master of Education. He's a retired high school administrator. He has a very distinguished award, which I'll try to pronounce properly. He's an officier dans l'ordre des arts et des lettres de la République française. Extremely distinguished speaker, and I'm very happy to welcome Edmond Elbaz.
Thank you, Professor Gehr, for your generous presentation. My friend Jim Archibald presented a lot of ethics that could be also applied to education, like respect, dignity, religion, difference of opinions, expressions, and so on. My presentation is going to be mainly anecdotal, based on personal experiences. So let me start by saying that my topic is ethical issues in school administration. As we all know, ethical dilemmas are by definition situations in which there is a difficult choice to be made between two or more options, neither of which resolve the situation in a manner that is consistent with accepted ethical guidelines. Let me give you two personal examples which until today come back to mind. Some 25 years ago, I was confronted with a major dilemma. I was a member of an advisory board at the Ministry of Education in charge of allocating permits, renewals, and fundings for the private schools in Quebec. My function, together with the other 8 board members, all confirmed by the National Assembly of Quebec, was to review and audit the requests received by each school, then present our decisions once a month to the government. Each permit renewal required many weeks of work to complete by each school administration, often with the assistance of a lawyer to avoid any legal issues. So imagine how surprised I was one day when I received, among a pile of files from English, French, Armenian, Jewish, and Greek private schools, a request for a new permit coming from the Muslim community of Montreal. The Muslim community was growing considerably and needed, understandably, its own religious school, refusing to send any longer their children into the public sector. The dossier presented to me and to the board was well completed with all the requirements asked, including the financial operation for the first 2 years. What was troubling me the most at that time was the tension in the Middle East. We all understand this situation. Suicide bombings and terrorism were in constant news with the tragic numbers of innocent victims on all sides. My first reaction, I have to admit, was to abstain from giving any recommendation on this particular file. I even considered being absent at the next session in Quebec to avoid making any decision that goes against my emotions of the moment or my own personal values. After thinking about it for a few days, I decided otherwise and attended the meeting. When asked at the parliamentary session to give my opinion, I responded without hesitation that I was in favor of the opening of the Muslim religious school, which I will add to the plurality of our Quebec society. I could not help to see around the table the expression of my colleagues. They all were guessing what will be my answer. How this Jewish board member going to react to this very delicate question at these times of tension, of trouble in the Middle East, and by repercussions here also in Montreal and Quebec. What will be his verdict? A permit to operate a religious school along the lines of the government regulation to teach a required numbers of hours of secular studies was eventually delivered a few days later to the Muslim community of Montreal, to their great joy. Few days after receiving their permit to operate, the administrators of the school come to my office at GPPS then to thank me for my support. A month later, they come back to ask me to share our program of studies that presents step by step what we teach at every level. Their idea was to use it as whole without the Jewish component that they will replace by the Quranic studies or religious studies or whatever. Offered our program of studies, naturally, after receiving the green light from my education committee. Then a few days later, I was invited by the school principal of this Muslim school to sit in a classroom one day and share my observations with him. His office was packed from the floor to the ceiling with boxes of books that he mentioned proudly having received recently from Saudi Arabia. 2 female teachers were in charge of the girls' classroom that I visited. They both were wearing hijab. However, I clearly noticed that the older one had a French-Canadian accent, while the other one had a foreign accent. When I ventured before leaving to ask the French-Canadian teacher how come she's wearing a hijab, she responded with no hesitation that it was part of the dress code. So I told her, well, my dear, in our religious schools also, we have a dress code for our female teachers, also for our male teachers, and your dress code is perfectly understandable, which made her very easy. Do I regret having been instrumental in opening a Muslim school in Montreal? The first one. The answer is clearly no. If I have declined as a Jew, other board members present would have agreed to it without hesitation. I was asked to give my opinion first by the chairman of the session, which I did as the most senior member of the board. My conclusion is, on this first part of my presentation, our mission as Jews is always to do what's good, leaving our emotions aside. I'm going to move now to my second example that has to do with the high school of the cost, so the high cost of Jewish education and its impact on the Jewish communities around the world. Jewish education had clearly, over the years, become accessible only to the very few ones that can afford it. It became elitist, although their mission is to provide every Jewish child with Jewish education. Long gone is the Alliance Israélite Universelle that has educated over 1 million children in Iraq, Syria, Iran, North Africa, free of charge over only 20 years, from 1945 to 1965. I am the product of L'Alliance Schools, together with many other leaders in Montreal, Europe, and Israel. By the way, many of the members of our congregation had also got their education from L'Alliance. So clearly, Jewish education had become elitist with terrible consequences. I read recently in the Times of Israel, you may have seen it also, that during the war with Hamas, over 60% of young Jewish adults in the States were indifferent toward Israel or avoid defining themselves as Jews. This is terrible, unacceptable. This is the result of the lack of vision of many Jewish leaders for not making Jewish education accessible to all, and by doing so, assuring also a Jewish continuity. What was my dilemma in this case? I had to take a strong stand once to protect a family whose 3 children were going to be evicted from school for not having paid their school fees. For years, this family was paying its school fees regularly until the father unfortunately went bankrupt. After a few warnings from the school, the director of finance decided to draft a registered letter, harsh one, to the parents, informing them to keep their children at home until they fully pay their dues. As a school administrator, I was aware of the difficult financial situation that we were facing, naturally. But on the human side, I just could not accept this idea. It wasn't right or ethical to expel 3 children whose parents couldn't pay the school fees. I forced my colleague to cancel that letter, despite strong objections from some members of the board, for whom balancing the budget was the primary concern. In Deuteronomy, it's written, do what's right and good in the eyes of Hashem. There is no dilemma when choosing what is right and just, period. So there is no dilemma in it. It's clear for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmond Elbaz. It was really, really good to hear some real world and real life case studies that you yourself experienced. And I think we can draw some inspiration from that. So our third and final speaker, well, he's now the current president of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, and he has to follow 2 tough acts from the previous past presidents. So our next speaker is Charles Shemie, who was born in Iraq and moved or escaped actually to Montreal with his parents at the age of 5 in 1965. So I guess he was not a beneficiary of this educational alliance that Edmond was referring to. Charles obtained a CPA and a CA from McGill in 1986, and now owns and operates a full-service accounting firm in Montreal. He's married to Lucy, and he has two children, Michael and Sophie. Charles, could you please go ahead with your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Ronald, and thank you, Edmond and Jim. It was a great conference that you had, and I learned quite a bit. So as you know, I'm a chartered accountant, CPA, and I'm going to talk to you about code of ethics from that angle. There are many similarities to all codes of ethics in all professions, but I think what distinguishes from my profession is the emphasis on financial ethics, and more specifically, independence and conflicts of interest. So I think a lot of emphasis is put on that from my profession, and for good reason. Just to let you know, my profession as a CPA auditor is to give my opinion on the financial position of a company. This opinion is important because it's used by many different parties. So it could be used by the banks on whether to determine whether they're going to lend money. It could be used by investors as to whether they will, as to making their decision as to what to invest and whether they should invest in that company. So it's really quite important, and it's quite important that we remain independent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that to you today. Just to let you know, I started my career in a very large international accounting firm, and it's important, which you'll find out later on. So it was considered as one of the big 8 in Canada. So to accept an engagement as an auditor of a company, you have to be independent. So as the word says, independent, a lot of it is logical. So for example, if I have an immediate family member that's going to benefit financially from this company, will I be able to take on this engagement? Clearly, no. Or what if I'm being offered inducements such as complimentary tickets to attend sporting events, things like that, which happen all the time? Those things are unacceptable. And we live in a very competitive nature. So many other accounting firms want to try to get this specific account. So it's very easy for us to, for CPAs to quote low fees to obtain a new engagement. And it's dangerous because if this fee is so low that it might be difficult to perform the professional services in accordance with the applicable professional standards for that price. And what happens is that we start to take shortcuts, and we lose our perspective, and we may not see certain things. Another important aspect is a CPA having a close relationship with a client. Again, that's a really great area because, where do we get our clients from? Most of my clients, I got them through referrals or through, in the golf course, and you become friendly with them. So at what point is that friendship going to inhibit you from performing an audit on the client? So there's a lot of gray areas in that, and you always have to be careful. But aside from the basic independence, in fact, there's also what we call independence in appearance. So we can be independent in fact. So let's just say, I'll give you an example. Someone in my firm, another partner of my firm is auditing a client, and my son owns a share of that company. Does that impede your independence? I mean, I'm not involved in the audit. My partner is doing the audit. Will one share and impede his judgment? What about if it's 100 shares? Will that impede his judgment? Or what if my parents owned 1,000 shares of this company? Will that impede his judgment? Most likely and most definitively, I'm going to say no. My partner is not going to risk his credibility and the firm's credibility to do me a favor and to alter or to overlook certain things on a financial, on a company. So my answer is no. It's not going to impede his independence, clearly. But unfortunately, however, the fundamental problem is that independence in appearance has become a surrogate for independence in fact. So appearance and fact are equal in this case. And in that case, I would have to tell my son to, to discard that share of stock that he owns or whatever for us to be. So we always have to be conscious of these two aspects of independence in fact and in appearance. I would like to tell you, like when I first started my working in this big accounting firm, I was really impressed because on day one, I learned all this stuff on theoretical stuff in school. I start my first day in school at work, and they tell me go up to the personnel office. I go. They give me a list of shares that the company, that our accounting firm audits, list of companies traded in the public stock exchange, and they said, if you own any of these companies, you have to sell it today. So I said, wow, like I was very impressed. Like this is what I learned in at work, at school, and this is amazing. I was really like gung ho. So, but as you'll see in my example a little later on, that honeymoon came to a quick end. So I would like to say that I'd like to give you basically an example of a real life example in that firm that I'm talking about and what happened. And so basically, they had a very large client. Sorry, hold on a second. Sorry about that. So they had a very large accounting client with assets of $1.8 billion. It was located in Montreal, but it was pretty much of a worldwide, had assets worldwide. The partners in this accounting firm, there was a handful of partners that were in charge of the audit. They broke every rule in the book, even though they were senior partners, very adept at the rules of independence. So they would go out for lunches and dinners with this client. They would get all kinds of tickets to sporting events. They would, use their country house and so on and so forth. So they issued financials going back to 1990. They issued financial statements and a clean audit opinion, and in 1990, and this company declared bankruptcy in 1992. And investors, lenders, and creditors soon learned from the trustee in bankruptcy that the reported assets were virtually worthless. $1.8 billion, virtually worthless. Everybody lost a lot of money. This lawsuit went on for 20 years. It became the largest lawsuit, financial lawsuit in Canadian history, and the longest. And basically the defense strategy, the defense of the partners that I was working for, their strategy was basically scorched earth, war of attrition. But the judgment came through, and basically the judge said, and I'm going to read from here, the company, the accounting firm breached generally accepted auditing standards, and that the audited financial statements of ABC Company, contained numerous material misstatements and did not fairly present the financial position of the company. And she found that superficiality and brevity characterized the audits conducted by this firm. And the audit planning was performed in an automatic, thoughtless manner without professional judgment or serious consideration of anything other than going through the motions of mindless filling out of forms. So this lawsuit affected everybody, every partner in the firm, not just the partners that were in charge of the audit, but every single partner in Canada it affected. And luckily, I wasn't a partner. I was still a junior in those days, so I was okay. But you could just imagine that you got to always keep your eyes open, and being independence and conflicts of interest are the bedrock of our professional ethics. One last thing is I'm going to talk to you about being professional, my ethical professional behavior to speak as a Jew. I believe that the ethical professional behavior and being Jewish go hand in hand. In particular, is the commandment of thou shalt not steal. The public has entrusted me to properly report on the financial situation of a company. The public will use my opinion in their decision-making process. Purposely altering my opinion for my financial benefit and to the detriment of others is akin to stealing, in my opinion. And therefore, we have to be ethical as a Jew and as a professional. And I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Again, very, very apropos and not only enlightening, but quite horrifying story there, and an object lesson to all of us. So Rabbi Menahem White from Gehr very kindly agreed to moderate the question and answer session. I will just give a very brief bio for Rabbi White. So if you haven't picked up Rabbi White's accent already and realize that he speaks like the late President Kennedy, you'll realize that he's a Bostonian. He obtained his BA from Yeshiva University in New York, and with majors in classics and Hebrew. He also received his smicha from Rabbi Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University. Rabbi White, in addition to his smicha and BA, has an MA from Brandeis in the Department of Near Eastern Studies and a PhD from McGill in Biblical Studies. Rabbi White was recruited from New York to teach Talmud and Bible at Herzliya, where he has been since 1976. And he has also been the rabbi of Gehr since 1995. Now, I understand that, Rabbi White, you do wish to say a few words yourself before we go to the question and answer session. Is that correct?
Yeah, okay, let me just... these were very, very interesting. It's really an interesting program. So if I could just make a few comments. First of all, to Professor Archibald, I found something interesting. I noticed a couple points which I had thought about that you had mentioned when Trudeau said that he's a Catholic, but I heard him say he's very disappointed in the Catholic Church. It sort of reminded me of Jews, Jewish people who say, I'm a proud Jew, but I'm so ashamed of what Israel does. so he's sort of thinking like a Jew that way. That's unfortunate, but that's that situation. But one thing also he mentioned, of course, the dignity of a profession. And I'm afraid that this was the great downfall of the previous president of the United States. And he did some things which are very good for Israel. And many people were very, very happy with him about the way he approached and the respect that he had to Israel. But unfortunately, the lack of dignity that he had for his office and things that he said, unfortunately, led to his downfall. And I know I had said that from the very outset. I was very upset. That's why I can say it now, I couldn't vote for him. I do vote in the United States elections, but I couldn't vote for him because of the way he acted, what I thought the lack of dignity was. If I could just say, I had been thinking of, a rabbi has to talk about the Parsha, and I've been thinking about something in the Parsha which, in my opinion, relates to the general topic that we have of administration and supervision. So if you would just be kind for a couple of minutes, I try to express things that went through my mind. What happened was, that you mentioned that I had my degree from McGill. Now, my dissertation at McGill was on the topic of the Aramaic translation of the book of Tehillim, the book of Psalms. So sort of an esoteric topic. So after that, I figured I wanted to study a little bit something perhaps a little less esoteric. And I took a few courses in the field of educational administration. And in one of the textbooks that we had to buy for the course, I remember the first chapter was an introduction to the field of administration and organization. And it gave the history of organization. And the example that they gave was from Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. Jethro came to visit Moses, and he said, you know, you can't do this. You can't do everything by yourself. He said, you're going to wear out. Navol tibol, you're going to wear out. You just can't do this. And he explained to him the purposes of delegation and organization. And what I found really interesting, and the thought that had come to me, and I had mentioned it independently of this program tonight, but I mentioned to to some people in the Chevre Shas that 2 weeks ago we read in the Torah Parashat Bahalotcha. In Parashat Bahalotcha, Yitro comes to Moshe and he says, I have to go home. I have to go back. Very nice, I've been here, but I have to go back to my home. And by the way, there he's called Chovav, but according to tradition, it's the same as Yitro, same person. And Moshe pleads him. He says, you have to stay with us. Please, stay here. Yitro says, no, I have to go home. Because it reminds me when I spent a month in New Jersey with my children, after my wife passed away, and I said, it's time for me to go back. They said, no, you have to stay a bit longer. And I said, I want to stay, but I just have to get back to Montreal. And but Moshe said, you are the Einayim, you are our eyes. And I just said, no, I'm going to leave. Now it's interesting that immediately after that, in the same parasha, the people start complaining bitterly to Moshe. And Moshe there, read the words, he loses it. Moshe seems, he loses it. And I wonder if perhaps there's a connection that without Yitro, Moshe forgot about delegation of powers, about proper organization, until Hashem finally tells him, you have to appoint assistants. You can't come on like this. And I think maybe this week's parasha also, when Korach, he rebels against authority. He doesn't realize, doesn't understand anymore the importance of having a delegation, having organization. And one person has to be in charge. You have to have one person in charge. You can't have an open rebellion. So anyway, that was a thought that I had, and I think it connects to some of the topics that we had mentioned tonight. So okay, now Ronnie, tell me what I'm supposed to do now.
Well, now it would be the question and answer session. So what I'm going to ask is, if people would like to ask a question, please click on the participants logo at the bottom of your screen and then raise your hand. And then I'll ask you to ask the question. please keep what you say in the form of a question and not a comment. And the question could be to one of the three speakers, or more than one, or to Rabbi White if it's a question of halacha, because obviously Rabbi White is our resource person in that area for this evening. So I see one hand so far. Albert Herskovich, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ronnie. I'll do that very quickly because I have to leave and go to another Zoom. But first, I'd like to congratulate all the speakers tonight on their amazing presentation. One in particular that struck me is the one given by Charles, that as it relates to halacha. Since Rabbi White is here with us and we're in a synagogue forum, let me ask a question on halacha. Charles, you were saying that one of the functions of an auditor is to check the books so that the banks would look favorably to a company and enable them to get loans. Now, normally when anyone gets a loan from a bank, they're expected to pay interest. Now, we have a law in halacha as well that tells us that after 7 years, you have to forgive the loans. So I wonder how you treat that aspect of forgiving a loan according to halacha when you're auditing a company.
You're asking me that question?
If you would, Charles, please. Yeah.
Well, we don't deal in that aspect in our, with the companies that I deal with, but I do have clients, Orthodox clients, and they have their own way of lending money to each other. And it's basically it's basically, if you look at the face of these contracts, they're interest free, but they get their benefits in other ways. So it's really, to me, I think it's just a waste of time the way they're doing it, because they're not really following the religious rules. Although, even though they're ultra orthodox, it's like substance over form. If you look at the agreement, it shows it's zero interest, but in fact, it's far from zero interest. So to me, it's kind of like a waste of time. I mean, in my opinion. But the banks will not. The banks are going to charge interest, of course, and that's how they make their money. I don't know if I answered your question.
Rabbi White, do you have a comment there, please?
Yeah, so in terms of the loan being forgiven after 7 years, first of all, that does not apply nowadays. That's connected, that's sort of an ideal situation with the laws of the Shemitah. We do have something called a pruzbul in order, which people do take care of. It's a way of sort of getting around that. Well, but that's not exactly the case that Mr. Shemie was speaking about. The case that he was referring to is that a Jew is not supposed to charge is not to pay interest, charge interest, and so we do have this system called a heter iska, which is a complicated legal system. It creates a difficult situation because, on the one hand, business today, we know, does depend upon interest. So the world we live in today is a rather complicated situation. We pay interest. Without interest, I guess the world would not go around, because there should be a reasonable amount of interest and an ethical amount of interest. But on the other hand, we do have the law of the Torah. So what they do is that there is a legal system that is created called a heter iska that would allow somebody to pay interest. It's a difficult situation because on the one hand you have the law of the Torah, on the other hand you have the recognition that we live in a type of a society today that simply couldn't apply. Maybe in an ideal society would apply, but today it just couldn't apply. So therefore we have to create that certain situation. And the same thing with what I called after 7 years. So we have what's called the Plus Bowl. It's interesting that the Talmud already said that in the time of the Talmud, they recognized that because lenders would not give out money because they said that we're never going to get the loan back. This is not a matter of interest, it's a matter of getting the loan back. So they said, because somebody's going to come to us, especially if they come to us and say year 4 or 5 of the 7-year cycle, so what do? So what did the rich people do in that case? They just stopped lending money. So what happened is the poor people became poorer because they had no way in which they could borrow money. So already in the time of the Mishnah, going back, over 2,000 years ago, they realized that this law, as beautiful as it is, functions in an idea. It's an ideal society. And unfortunately, we just don't live in ideal societies. So what they did was they created a document called the Plus Bowl. And in the Plus Bowl, it says something like this. It says that, so if I lend you money, okay, and you have to pay me back, but I am handing my loan over to the courts. Let's say to the Vadair or whatever. It's not really the Vadair, but I'm giving my money over to the courts. And the courts have a right to ask for the money back, and then the courts will give it to me. So that's the concept of a Plus Bowl. So I'm saying you raise a good question, Charles. I mean, it's an interesting question. Is it worth going to all of this paperwork and having all of these documents? As I say, the problem is this is the law in the Torah. The law in the Torah, they said, probably applies to an ideal situation. We just don't live in an ideal society, as we all know. So we try to solve it in that way. So that briefly is what I guess what I could say.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi White. So Gladys, would you like to ask a question now?
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I hear you.
Okay. I just would like, I want to thank everybody for, we can know everybody more closely like this. And it's very interesting and we are very happy to hear everybody. I'm glad that what our past president, Edmond Elbaz, spoke about the Alliance because I am from the Alliance. And I owe everything that I have is from the Alliance in Baghdad. But I want to say it was very expensive. I heard that it's only in Baghdad, only in Iraq it was expensive because I have my friends from Alliance Lebanon and they said it was very cheap. But in Baghdad it was very expensive, especially if somebody has a few children and they wouldn't give discount unless you are really poor. They give you, or they tell you, take your child to another school because they were Jewish schools free, but they didn't teach like the Alliance. If you want to Alliance, you have to pay. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, I don't see any questions, but
Can I just say one more thing?
yes, please, and then I'll take privilege and I'll ask a couple of questions. So please go ahead, Rabbi White.
No, I just wanted to say that really, it's really a pleasure. The 3 speeches were really so worthwhile and so interesting, and I really appreciate listening to all of the speeches. Okay.
So I have actually 2 questions for Jim Archibald. The first one is, when you mentioned that it's important to maintain the employer's trust, and you were speaking about the public sector, and I'm thinking actually the employer is the taxpayer. Am I correct about that? So that's the first question. In other words, who is the employer of somebody in the public service? And the second question is, what about politicians who are on the one hand in the public service, but on the other hand, they have this motivation to get reelected. Otherwise, they lose their job, they lose their salary. So that's a kind of a conflict almost. Perhaps you could comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. It sort of cuts back to what Rabbi White asked as well, with regard to the issue of maintenance of dignity in the profession. So, as I like to tell Rabbi White, we're landsmen. In a sense, we come from the same place. So I understand what he's saying. And one of the important things, of course, in political life is the fact that we have expectations of people who become involved in political life, in that the work that they will be doing as elected officials will be in the public interest. And of course, from a legal point of view, it's a very difficult, very slippery term to define what is the actual public interest. And if we look at the Quebec situation, and we look at professionals in the Quebec situation, the sole purpose of professional orders in Quebec is to protect the public. In other words, there's a role of protection, which becomes important. So it's important that the practicing engineer designs a bridge which isn't going to fall down. It becomes very important that the accountant does an audit which is truthful, etc. And so if we look at politicians from that point of view, and I like Rabbi White's example of former President Trump, the first realization is that former President Trump was not a professional before he was elected. So therefore, to pick up on your introductory comment, he maybe is a public administrator, but as a professional, he's a very small p professional in that sense. And he had no sense, I think the jury is out on this particular one, but he has no sense of dignity in that sense. And so therefore he betrayed the public trust. And if we look at the way things are currently moving forward, he has not in fact protected the public, and he has not protected the institutions, and he's not protected the Constitution. And it's clear that in terms of his oath of office, remember we talked about in one of the previous sessions, Chevois, we talked about the importance of oaths. And it's important that people abide by their oaths if they do it. And professionals, of course, have to bear this in mind. So in order to do that, this segues into your other question, is a question of trust. Of course, if we look at the Treasury Board's definition of loyalty, the Treasury Board sets down these ethical guidelines and basically says that the professional who works in the public service has to be trustworthy. And so therefore, the public service, from an institutional point of view, has to be able to trust the professional in that particular function. You have to trust the engineer, you have to trust the accountant, you have to trust the person who's involved in the administration of public health, et cetera, et cetera. So the trust issue is not a one-way street. From the point of view of the Treasury Board, yes, you have to make sure that the public institution can trust you as a professional. But on the other hand, you have to act in such a way as to be trustworthy. And I think Charles Shemie's example in accounting bears witness to that. So these issues are very much interrelated, and it's important for the professional in the public service to be able to deal with these issues of trust, these issues of dignity, and the role that they have in promoting the public interest. And this is clear in the guidelines from the Treasury Board. and they have to be clear as far as the types of behavior that they engage in, which will in fact promote trust. So that's very much part of the whole ethical concept that we're dealing with the professions in the public interest.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question?
No one dares ask a question because the answer might be too long.
Well, yeah, well, okay, but we still have a few minutes. So I'd like to ask Charles a question, but it actually applies to any of the other speakers too, I think, and that is the question of the whistleblower. So when, Charles, when you were working for this large company as a junior employee, would it have been possible for you to blow the whistle if you had discovered that there was some underhand activities taking place? And if so, would you have suffered because of that? And maybe things have changed. So maybe things were very difficult for whistleblowers in those days, but perhaps things have changed for today.
Oh, absolutely no. I think they would be very happy because these accountants, they were negligent. It wasn't in their best interest for this to happen. I mean, so if myself as a junior accountant at the time would have gone up to them and said, listen, there's, things are not properly being recorded, they would be thrilled. So it's not, I would be a whistleblower, but in a good way. Because they didn't benefit financially from these things. They were just negligent. They just closed their eyes to a lot of stuff, and they just trusted them too much, and they got taken away. They got they got taken away from all of these perks that they were getting. So that's the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Ronnie, can I add one comment to that?
Yes, please.
Because when I took my notes, I also made a note about whistleblowers. And if you look at the guidelines from the International Bar Association, this actually involves the question of to what degree is a professional who has to exhibit loyalty in a particular situation free to express himself or herself in a particular situation, free to give an opinion, free to share knowledge. And so on the one hand, it's an obligation to share knowledge, and it's an obligation to make sure that you do so in the public interest. So if you're a practicing engineer and you know that there's a fault in the construction of a bridge, and you know that the bridge is going to fall down and that so many thousand people may die because of this, it's your professional obligation to say so. You may get fired for it, but too bad. The point is that that's your professional obligation.
Okay, thank you very much. So,
Ron, I want to say something.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I want to refer to the last verse in the book of Esther. It says, for Mordechai the Jew was viceroy to King Ahasuerus. He was a great man among the Jews and found favor with the multitude of his brethren. He sought the good of his people and spoke for the welfare of all his seed. A lot of rabbis have an issue with the fact that the verse says a multitude of his brethren approved of him, but not all. After what happened, they felt that all of them should have approved. And this one explanation that comes from Chabad, from a Mamar, is that when you get involved in day-to-day reality, in political life, for example, or as a professional, you have to leave the purity of what you would be as just a Torah scholar. I mean, as a Torah scholar. And in fact, this verse is interpreted as the fact that when Mordechai became viceroy, when he became prime minister, he lost one notch in the Sanhedrin. meaning that he was in the top echelon. I don't know if it was position number 3 in the Sanhedrin. He fell from position number 3 to position number 4. So that means that sometimes to be in public life, you have to lie a little bit. You have to bow to the reality of Professor Archibald, he said there is the idea of dissensus. I think the word was in dissensus means that a tension between two opposites remain that cannot be resolved. And I think that's what happened when you're a professional or where you're a politician or when you're involved in public life, you are placed in front of paradoxes that you don't have the luxury of the purity of when you're a Torah scholar in a different environment. So you come down a notch, you lose a little bit. It's like the idea that spirituality is a bit contradictory with materiality. So I just wanted to make that point. I don't know what other people think about that. And also in that context, I heard a lot of Trump bashing. I think Trump is viewed as someone who tells a lot of lies. And I think you have to distinguish between lies and lies. There are some lies that are benign lies. And I think he said a lot of benign lies. But there are some lies that are crucial, that can destroy, that can cause severe damage. And those kind of lies, I don't think he said. So I come to his defense. We'll see what the future holds. He's still in the picture in the background, and we'll see what will happen. But it's again this idea that sometimes you're in a paradoxical situation and you have to hold a very tight line where you need to not be 100% pure. That's it. I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay, thank you very much for the comments, which I'm sure will give people something to think about. And I think this is a good place actually to end. It's always good to end with some questions, not to have everything resolved. So on that note, I'd like to thank our three speakers for really, I found it extremely stimulating, so many different angles, and it's just wonderful to see our three presidents or past presidents on the same podium, so to speak, and really giving us a view of their professional life, which we could all benefit from. So thanks everybody for coming. And in about a month from now, we're going to have our fourth session, which will cover the legal profession. So thanks again for attending. Stay safe and good night to everyone.